So Marvin, your memoir came out this year, Pivot Points, and the subtitle, Adventures on the Road to Christian Contentment. What I want to know is how long that road is.
Oh, probably a road that goes on and on and on.
Okay.
For me, it started in 1976, so 48 years ago when I became a Christian.
Do you know, can you readily think of a lot of content people?
Um,
That
yes.
pause is giving you away.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
No,
think so.
actually,
Okay.
I like my church a lot, Grace and Peace Austin, and yeah, I think there are a lot of contented people in that church. So it's not unusual. I think in the world generally, it's unusual.
Okay. And this can be a standalone. For full disclosure, as you know, I blurbed it. Those listening now know that. And Mr. Hank the cow dog here is on as a blurb.
Here's my shirt. Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Hank the cow dog.
That's why the shirt is there.
John Erickson, a rancher.
Yeah, shout out to him, and
Yep.
we'll take some percent of those royalties coming. This can be a standalone book, obviously, but it is really a companion to a previous book that I also read, Lament for a Father. Talk about the relationship between the two books.
Well, Lament for a Father is really about my grandparents and my parents. This is a continuation of that, and I think it's important because I feel when you think about the long road to contentment, I feel I'm part of a much longer road, going way back to Abraham 4,000 years ago, and I'm very thankful to my grandparents who left the Russian Empire to come to America very early in the 20th century. And any opportunities I have, I really owe to them. And to my parents who were married for 37 years, did not get divorced, but I think in today's culture they probably would because there were lots of arguments, but they stayed together. And difficult as it was at times with arguing parents, still much better than if I had gone into the foster care system and so forth. I'm doing a lot of writing on homelessness these days, and there's a real correlation between people who have had very jagged childhoods with broken families, and then often foster care or being sent around and homelessness. So, yeah, my parents spared me all that, and this is really a continuation of that story, starting when I was 13 years old and bar mitzvahed up until recent times as I've learned more about some very pleasant things, some unpleasant things, but all part of the long road.
Now some people know your biography might have a little spotty idea, World Magazine, the books, etc. But you were a communist early on,
Yeah.
and it wasn't just a passing fad. I think about like Augustine in Confessions was enamored with the words and writings of Cicero. You were enamored with the writings of Lenin and Marx. It wasn't a passing fad, as I said, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think Augustine was not a card-carrying Pelagian or anything in his early years, but I was actually a card-carrying communist. I had a card, and this came out of growing up in the 1960s and the Vietnam War, and caring about poverty, and I would like to put it in very high-minded terms like that. But I think a lot of it was internal and wanting to, in some way, differentiate myself from my classmates. I went to college at Yale with a lot of very affluent people, and I was probably shy and conflicted in lots of ways, but I didn't want to look at myself. I wanted to say, well, they are the ruling class and I must oppose them by being on the left, as most of them were, but going from the liberal left to the radical left and then even further into the very destructive, in the sense of killing anyone who gets in your way, communism.
So those, again, who know you to some degree, maybe they know you're a Presbyterian and even a Presbyterian elder. You do not have what you would think, coming from that background, if they know that the Christian Marvin Olasky, a conversion story that's your kind of standard brand Presbyterian kind of conversion. Tell us a little bit about what happened, like at Michigan, in this kind of unusual thing that.
Yeah, sometimes people, and whether it's Presbyterian at times or in the Billy Graham tradition of a moment of decision, sometimes people talk about going from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. My own case, I had a very, I had a moment, or a day actually, that went on for 10 hours on November 1st, 1973, and so I can remember that. 8 hours just sitting in my chair and not doing any drugs, not sleeping, but just thinking, I'm an atheist, my communism was built on atheism, but somehow I had the sense that there is a God. And thought about that for 8 hours, and then went out at 11 p.m. And walked around for 2 hours around the University of Michigan campus where I was in graduate school, and just thinking over and over again, there is a God, and therefore my communism is really pretty dumb. And so several days after that, I actually, after thinking about it for maybe 48 or 72 hours, I went to the local Communist Party leader in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and said, I'm out of here, and never looked back at that point to that. But that didn't make me a Christian. That made me a theist of some weak sense. But hey, this is Ann Arbor, college town. Augustine wrote about wanting to continue in his lust for a while. This is Ann Arbor, college town. I want to do that. I didn't want
Make me chase, but not yet.
Not yet. So there was all that. But for the next 2.5 years, almost 3 years, there were stones on the road that I stumbled over, and at the time I thought these were inconvenient stones, but I realized that they're in God's sovereignty, those are placed for a purpose. Just to give you 2 examples of that, first, to get a PhD, at least at that point, you had to have a reading knowledge of a foreign language. And I had forgotten my childhood Hebrew, never did very well in high school French. My language was Russian. I had traveled to the Soviet Union, I had taken a summer course in Russian, had to keep doing that in order to pass the language test. And I had, not out of desire, just out of convenience and as I thought coincidence, I had in my room, rummaging through my bookcase, I found the only book in Russian that was there at that point. It was a copy of the New Testament in Russian that I'd gotten through a long process a couple of years before, kind of a souvenir. So started reading it just for Russian reading practice, and by the time I got to chapter 5 of Matthew, reading the Sermon on the Mount, that just seemed extraordinary to me, because in communism it wasn't stone for stone, punch for punch, or anything like that. It was hit a person, and if he hits you, hit back, and probably shoot him with, as they used to say in Stalin's days, 9 grams of lead to the back of the head.
Very poetic.
Very poetic. So this was communism. And here the Sermon on the Mount actually turned the other cheek. This seemed very weird, but it seemed like something not from man but from God.
Right.
So that got me thinking, and as I kept reading the New Testament very slowly, got me thinking. Another thing that was very important is I was assigned to teach a course in early American literature as a graduate student. None of the regular professors wanted to teach it because early American literature, lots of Puritan sermons. And regular professors didn't want to waste time reading these 3-century-old dead white males. I had to read them. I had to do a crash course. I never studied it. And over the summer of 1974, I just had to be reading Puritan sermons. And they got to me because I had grown up with the prejudice that Christians are stupid people who worship Christmas trees. And with the Puritans, the Puritan preachers, you might like them, you might hate them, but you can't call them stupid. I mean, they were very logical, very work things out. Right. And that impressed me. Right. And I'd like to say that right away then I thought, this is truth, I'm going to turn to it, but no. I wanted to just continue with the Ann Arbor culture. Yeah. I knew certainly becoming a Christian was not going to help me in my academic career. So I just kept waiting, and other things happened. And then eventually, 3 years after first coming to believe there's a God, I finally got to the point, yes, it's obvious that there is a God. It also seems, and this was my weak expression of faith at that point, seems highly likely that the New Testament is true and Christ is God, and I'm going to sign up and profess faith and join a church, which I did. And my wife has her own story, but they all, in God's mercy, came together, and we both joined the First Baptist Church of La Mesa, California, where I just gone to teach for a year at San Diego State.
Right. By the way, Susan gave me a really good segue, not planned at all. So if the camera, which I imagine did, picked up that screech noise a couple minutes back, you have a very steep driveway. And my next question was, that was Susan gassing it to get up the driveway. My next question really is about Susan. Anyone that knows you knows that you regularly, both in print, publicly, etc., have a great affection and really honor your wife. Tell us a little bit about what, when you first met her, what impressed you about her, and now here almost 50 years later, still going strong. I'm sure there's many things you could say, but what did impress you when you first met her?
Well, I guess at first met her initially, and this is typical guy stuff. Oh, she's very pretty.
Yeah.
The second thing, and it didn't take me long to realize this, she's very smart. And then third thing, which jumped on the other two and was really important. Oh, she actually wants to listen to me, which I think was a rare thing among young ladies at that time. And I wanted to listen to her.
Yeah.
So we started dating right away. We got married 9 months after we met, and 11 months after we got married, we had our first child, which was certainly a further bond at that point. So yeah, she's pretty, she's smart. We talk with each other, what's not to like.
Yeah.
And then increasingly I learned she was always my first editor, and I've had some very good editors, but she was really my best editor.
Wow.
So she's helped enormously with the books I've written, and then I helped a little bit with the 8 children's books she's written, which are great books. I will say to the camera right here, great books.
And she needs to be writing more. We're going to tease her about that.
Exactly
I
right.
am anyway.
Exactly right.
She needs to be writing more.
Yeah, there's a series of 4 books about Annie Henry, the second oldest daughter of Patrick Henry at the time of the American Revolution. Great books, set in Virginia. And then another series of 4 books with a boy hero, Will Northaway, set in Massachusetts at the time of the Revolution. Great books. Go out, read them. Anyway, yeah, no, she's really good. Yeah.
So even a brief interview with you would not be complete without asking you a little bit about journalism generally, and specifically Christians being involved in journalism. So you taught University of Texas for many years. You've written books on journalism. You edited World. You've mentored a lot of journalists, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands. You have a journalism award, the Zenger Prize. You've been steeped in this, obviously, all your life, starting out at the Boston Globe and all that sort of thing. Do Christians have a decided advantage in doing good journalism? Are there any things about the Christian worldview that give it a leg up to do better journalism?
Yes and no. The yes is journalists for years, at least a century, have talked about objectivity, but the definition has moved. At one point, objectivity, when photography was first coming in the late 19th century, people made an analogy to the camera. You set up a camera, the journalist looks, and he writes what he sees. But of course, as we know, what you see in the camera depends on where you're pointing the camera, what the goal of the photographer is, also things like lighting and speed of film and all those types of things. So it's not that simple. And as journalists increasingly often clashed with publishers, publishers often being conservative, journalists often increasingly in the 20th century being liberal, objectivity attained a different definition. The compromise between journalists and publishers was going to be, well, we're going to tell both sides. And of course, sometimes there are more sides than 2, and your definition of what those sides are and what's an honorable side also varies. For example, it used to be back in the 1970s when Roe v. Wade first came into being in 1973, sometimes journalists would report 2 sides. They'd report the pro-life side and the pro-choice side. But increasingly among journalists, the pro-life side was seen as illegitimate, not really a good side to report. And so objectivity became, well, we're not really going to practice objectivity in terms of the balancing of sides. We're going to practice subjectivity. Here are our beliefs about abortion, and we're going to show things that illuminate those beliefs and help others believe in that way. So increasingly, journalism has moved from this from this idea of objective truth to a balancing of subjectivities to, well, let's throw out the balancing and just be subjective. But if the Bible is true, and we as Christians know it is, then actually you do have some understanding of what truth is. What God says in the Bible and expresses in the Bible and the way God looks at the world he created, that's truth. And you have a way of understanding what the truth is and how you should be reporting, which doesn't mean refusing to listen to people, let's say, to continue this particular example, you want to listen to people who are expounding and defending and promoting abortion, but you want to listen to them. You then also want to see what we know objectively, both from the Bible and from the medical evidence, that unborn children are human beings and deserve protection. So I think Christians have an advantage in knowing what true objectivity is, biblical objectivity, which again, you want to quote people, you want to explain people's positions clearly, you don't want to be a propagandist, but you also want to try to describe reality, and we know what reality is from what the Bible says and teaches us. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage these days is it's very hard for Christians to work on major newspapers and mainline magazines. Now, it's very hard for just about everyone as newspapers and magazines are in trouble, but Christians, it's particularly hard because Christians have a worldview that's often antithetical to the worldview their editors have. And so Christians may be assigned to go out and write an article on a particular topic, but if they try to write this article with biblical objectivity, or even the old-fashioned objectivity, namely a balancing of subjectivities, they're often told, well, no, that's not good. We want someone who will express our view, the view of the editors and the view of most of the reporters. So Christians have an advantage. That is, if they're good writers, and we can train people with basic good writing skills to be good reporters. But they also have a disadvantage that it's hard to get hired and easy to get fired.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you touched on the realism, really reporting what happened, but also believing redemption can take place. So when you are describing events, there doesn't have to, I'm going to be so realistic, I'm cynical or hopeless. But as a Christian, I can say I can really describe the hard scrabble realities here, but also maybe fold in the humane, like look at this guy's background,
right.
So there's a fuller view of human nature that seems to me to be a significant advantage in really giving a more accurate portrayal.
Yeah, it is a significant advantage, but there are also non-Christians who write good stories. I'm really struck by one fellow on the New York Times, of all places, named Eli Saslow, who writes feature articles for them and has done terrific work. So, yeah, it's an advantage, but there are reporters who actually look at reality and overcome some of the biases of the newsroom and write really good stories. And in fact, rather than just listening to me say that, I would suggest anyone who's watching this go to Zenger.com, www.zengerhouse.com, Zenger House, one word, and look at, there are 28 examples of really good stories. We gave out 8 awards in the first year of Zenger Prizes, 10 each last year and this year. Go read those stories. About half of them are by people who profess faith in Christ, and the other half by others, but they're all good stories. So it's an advantage, but not an absolute necessity at times to write a good story, and I would just, again, suggest people look for yourselves, www.zengerhouse, Z-E-N-G-E-R, Zenger rather than Zinger, Z-E-N-G-R house.com, and read some of those stories.
Well, thanks very much. Pivot Points is terrific.
Thank you, David.